and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
Good morning, this is To The Point on GB News with me, Anaya Flaren Inman and Mercy Moroki on your TV, radio and online. We're with you until midday with a show jam-packed with the biggest stories, lots of discussions and expert guests, as well as our opinions and yours.
Yes, lots to come up in our show today, and we'd love to hear your views as usual, so get them in at gbviews@gbnews.uk. We'll try and get to as many as we can throughout the programme, but first, here's your latest headlines.
Good morning, it's 1 minute past 10. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Patients in England will be expected to get an appointment with their GP within 2 weeks under plans to be unveiled by the new Health Secretary this morning. Under the reforms, it's also expected Therese Coffey will pledge patients with urgent needs will be seen on the same day. It's part of a drive to improve access to doctors' appointments as she unveils her NHS plan for this winter and next.
One of the things that I want to do is to not be prescriptive with GPs in how they interact with their patients, but to make sure that those service levels or expectations are met. And we want to work on a local NHS level to make sure that those practices that aren't meeting that expectation of patients being able to see a GP within 2 weeks, how we can help them do that.
Meanwhile, the Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting told GB News an NHS workforce plan should be a top priority.
Unless we recruit more doctors and nurses, unless there's a workforce plan for the NHS, there just isn't a plan for the NHS. And what really worries me is that this is our third Health Secretary in 6 months. And I've not seen any sign in the newspapers that she's planning to grip that particular issue. Unless we recruit those doctors and nurses, more people will leave the profession. That means longer waits, worse care, and I think people are sick and tired of waiting.
The Bank of England is expected to unveil the biggest hike in interest rates for over 3 decades this morning. The Monetary Policy Committee is expected to increase rates by 0.75% to 2.5%. It would be the highest interest rate the UK's seen since the 2008 financial crisis. GB News' business and economic editor Liam Hannigan says homeowners will likely see a significant difference.
This is bad news if you've got a variable rate mortgage. Far fewer houses are mortgaged than they were 20 years ago. A lot more houses are owned outright because a lot of young people can't get on the housing ladder, obviously. And obviously, if you've got personal loans on variable rates, they will go up too. But spare a thought for Britain's army of savers who've been abused for decades now. A little bit of chink of hope for them.
The government has lifted a ban on fracking in England in a bid to increase what it calls homegrown sources of energy. The Prime Minister insists it'll stimulate more domestic gas supplies and has promised not to approve anything that carries risk amid concerns over earthquakes. A safety report by the British Geological Survey is due to be published later, with the government also expected to unveil how it plans to end the ban. A 16-year-old boy has been arrested on suspicion of murder in connection with the death of a 15-year-old boy who was stabbed to death in Huddersfield yesterday. An investigation has been launched after the teenager died in hospital following an attack close to the entrance of North Huddersfield Trust School. The head teacher says they've lost a wonderful student from their school community. Liz Truss has described Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine as a catastrophic failure in her first address before world leaders as Prime Minister. It came just hours after President Putin threatened to use nuclear weapons, warning he wasn't bluffing. He's calling up more than 300,000 military reservists to fight, which has sparked protests in cities across Russia. Meanwhile, 5 Brits captured whilst fighting alongside Ukrainians are among the 10 foreign nationals freed by Russian-backed forces. Aidan Aslin, John Harding and Sean Pinner, along with 2 more unidentified UK citizens, had been held captive for months. They've been released as part of a prisoner swap brokered by Saudi Arabia. The inquest into the death of a woman with an acute dairy allergy who died shortly after eating a pret-a-manger vegan wrap is due to conclude this morning. Celia Marsh died in 2017 after the coconut yoghurt used as dressing in the wrap is thought to have had traces of milk in it. And a spectacular new image of Neptune has been released by NASA. The James Webb Space Telescope has captured the clearest view yet of the planet, seen for the first time in infrared light. It's the most comprehensive look at Neptune's rings in 3 decades. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now, though, it's back to Anaya and Mercy with To The Point.
A very good morning. It's 10:06 and it's Thursday, and this is To The Point on GB News with myself, Mercy Moroki, and Inaya Falarin Iman on your TV, online and radio.
Well, the new Health Secretary, Theresa Coffey, will announce today a new plan to tackle the NHS backlog in the run-up to winter, with NHS data showing not a single trust in England has met its A&E waiting times. We'll bring you this live later in the programme.
Yes, and today the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee is due to announce their latest decision on interest rates. So could we see the largest rate rise for 30 years as the bank tries to curb inflation? Well, we'll be joined by our business and economics editor Liam Halligan later on to get the latest.
And Prime Minister Liz Truss will today lift the ban on fracking in a bid to boost domestic energy supply. We'll look at the pros and cons of the controversial method to extract natural gas.
Yes, that's all coming up on our programme and much more as well. We are here until midday, and make sure you get in touch with your views, gbviews@gbnews.uk. We do try and read as many as we can throughout the programme.
Well, Prime Minister Liz Truss has used her first speech on the world stage as Prime Minister to condemn Putin's nuclear threats as sabre-rattling. Here's what she had to say.
No one is threatening Russia. Yet as we meet here this evening, in Ukraine, barbarous weapons are being used to kill and maim people. Rape is being used as an instrument of war. Families are being torn apart. And this morning, we have seen Putin trying to justify his catastrophic failures. He's doubling down by sending even more reservists to a terrible fate. He's desperately trying to claim the mantle of democracy for a regime without human rights or freedoms. And he's making yet more bogus claims and sabre-rattling threats. This will not work. The international alliance is strong, and Ukraine is strong.
That was Liz Truss there speaking yesterday at that UN General Assembly in New York, while our political editor Darren McCaffrey has been in New York and he's been keeping us up to date on the proceedings. Here's the reaction he sent us.
Well, the Prime Minister didn't pull any punches in a speech at the UN General Assembly last night, in which he said that President Putin was desperate and will be defeated in the war in Ukraine. It was the first speech at the UN General Assembly here in New York, and she said that this was going to be a decisive moment in the history of freedom and that 2022 would be the story of freedom fighting back. Really interesting, this is part of the consistent line that we're seeing from the UK government. Liz Truss determined to prove that, following on from Boris Johnson, the UK will remain united in the support of Ukraine. She went on to say that the invasion had been a catastrophic failure and condemned the president for what she said were barbarous acts in the country. It was a widely, warmly received speech from Liz Truss, and it was echoed in many ways by some of the other speeches we heard at the United Nations yesterday, not least of all from Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, when he said that the answer is not to step down, but to stop supporting Ukraine. He said the answer, if anything, is to step up and to further support the country. All this followed, of course, Liz Truss' first bilateral meeting with the US President Joe Biden, again part of an effort to show a united front from the West when it comes to the war in Ukraine. Very much both leaders on the same page. Joe Biden insisting that the UK remains the strongest and oldest ally of the United States. In fact, a Downing Street spokesperson afterwards concluded that the pair both agreed to redouble their efforts to end the energy dependence on Russia and that they needed to find energy independence to ensure they didn't rely on authoritarianism when it comes to energy in the future. So what we're being painted is a very consistent picture from the UK government that effectively nothing has changed in the last couple of months, even though the government clearly has changed in Westminster. And this all is going to come ahead of the Foreign Minister, the new Foreign Minister, James Cleverly, who's going to be at the UN Security Council later on, alongside the Russian Foreign Minister. And again, being briefed out beforehand, a pretty tough message, it must be said, from the UK government. James Cleverly is going to set out how Russian forces continue to commit atrocities against Ukraine and violate international law, and that they need to be held accountable for it. Of course, the United Nations itself is all pretty impotent in regards to this, given the fact that Russia sits on that Security Council and has a veto. China, of course, has as well. But it is interesting as the Prime Minister now flies back to the United Kingdom. The focus here clearly has been on the war in Ukraine, but very much at home, the agenda will shift, won't it, to those interest rates decision we're expecting at midday today, and also to that key moment tomorrow, that fiscal event, and we're going to find out the substantial and rather controversial tax cuts that the government's going to embark on.
Well, our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, there, and he mentioned fracking, of course. That's a huge announcement that's come out of the last couple of days, that the government, Liz Truss, will be lifting that moratorium on fracking. And indeed, later on in the programme, we're going to be discussing the pros and cons of fracking. We know that's a way the government's trying to bolster the UK's energy security, so that and Europe is taking similar measures so as to not rely on gas from Russia.
And also send us your views on some of the things that Liz Truss has said, calling Putin's announcement to mobilise stronger when it comes to Ukraine, and also reiterating that threat of using nuclear weapons. She's described it as saber-rattling. Should we be taking those threats more seriously? Or do you think that it is him just using more threats because of his weak position? So it'd be very interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, now that today the new Health Secretary, Therese Coffey, will announce a new plan to tackle the NHS backlog. This is, of course, something that the government has been saying they're going to do for a long time. And all of this comes up in the run-up to winter.
Yes, the NHS own data shows that not a single trust in England met A&E waiting time targets during the year from April 2021 to March this year. Earlier this morning, she told Breakfast with Stephen and Isabel that patients were her top priority.
Top priority that I set out in our plan for patients is patients, and I'm covering in a variety of ways the things where patients rely most on access to the NHS, and that's actually through primary care. And that's why I've set out a clear expectation that when people phone up the surgery, first of all they get through, but also that they also can get an appointment, certainly within a fortnight, and for urgent cases, which many GPs are already brilliant at doing, getting that same day appointment so they can immediately get access to the care that they desperately need.
And Labour's Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, had this to say on GP appointment waiting times.
Yeah, we'll see what the Health Secretary says, but I've got to say, after 12 years in government, I think it's outrageous, actually, to present a 2-week wait to see a GP as good news for patients. When we were in government, we guaranteed GP access within 48 hours, just 2 days. We've got the biggest crisis in the history of the NHS, much of it a mess of the government's own making. And I think at this stage, after 12 years, expecting the Conservatives to deal with the NHS crisis is a bit like expecting the arsonists to put out the fire they created. It's not going to happen, and the longer they're in government, the longer patients will wait.
Well, our political reporter Catherine Forster joins us now from St Thomas Hospital in London. Catherine, thank you so much for joining us on the programme. Is politics well and truly back now with these announcements?
Yes, absolutely. Therese Coffey, the new Health Secretary, only just over 2 weeks into the job, is going to outline in the Commons, which is actually just behind on the other side of the Thames from here at St Thomas's Hospital, her plan to get the NHS through the winter and beyond. In Whitehall, they've been talking about A, B, C, D. A for ambulances, B for backlogs, C for care, that's social care, D for doctors and dentists. Now, obviously, We're going to find out much more later this morning or early afternoon when she gets up to speak. What we know now, which has already been trailed, is the government's plans for easier access to GP appointments. We know that many people are struggling to see their GP. The government will put in place an expectation you should be able to see your GP within 2 weeks. And that if it is urgent, you should be able to see your GP the same day. Now, there's a number of ways they're going to try to make this happen, including freeing up GPs' time by allowing pharmacists to prescribe medication for things like contraception, for pharmacists to accept referrals from A&E for minor ailments like coughs and sore throats. Also, for allowing GP practices, they're going to change the funding rules so that they can hire more GP assistants, more nurse practitioners that are senior nurses that are trained to carry out jobs that sometimes GPs will be doing at the moment. Now, they estimate that will free up about 3 million appointments a year. But that might sound like a lot, but in fact, that's only 1% of the total. So GP leaders this morning are underwhelmed, and the crisis in terms of staff shortages is really acute. We've got no detail about how that's going to be tackled as yet.
Catherine, thank you for bringing us that update. I think we're expecting Therese Coffey, the new Health Secretary, about 12:30, we're told now. So I'm sure you'll be keeping on top of that for us. We'll speak to you a bit later. Thank you, Catherine Forrester there, our political reporter.
Yes, indeed. And now let's talk to a GP on the front line of it all. We're delighted to be joined by Dr. Mike Smith, a GP in North London. Thank you so much for joining us on the programme. And what do you make of some of the announcements that have been said by the new Health Secretary, Theresa Coffey?
Good morning, ladies. I think when I heard the announcement, because it got leaked last night, I think that my face was planted firmly into my palm, because once again, it's not addressing the causes of the problems with the NHS at the moment, and particularly with general practice. And if we had, I know patients are not getting a good deal at the moment, both from GPs, both from hospitals, and I know that we all want to do better. But simply telling us, do better, see more patients, is not addressing the root causes. There is a simple problem here that we've been banging on for the best part of a decade. There are not enough doctors and nurses. There's anything from 5,000 to 10,000 GPs short in England, and there's probably a similar number of senior nurses within general practice and primary care. And unless somebody decides to address this problem, which is not a short-term problem, it's going to take years to sort this out, then we're just going to be having this same old cycle of flogging the dead horse even harder every winter, and people's morale is getting low. We've had the pandemic, which once again, contrary to public opinion, we've been working harder than ever during this. And I know, once again, that may not feel like that, but that's just because there's more people accessing health services. And then on top of that, we're told we've got an arbitrary 2-week target that doesn't really mean anything.
I did want to ask you, how low have our standards become that the Health Secretary is now offering what should be bare minimum things as sort of big announcements? If you need to see a GP that day, you're going to get to see one, apparently. If you want to see a GP within 2 weeks, you're going to get one. She's saying it's going to be a patient first approach. Surely these are basic fundamentals when it comes to a health system in a first world country.
No, I agree. And I've been to other health services, both in France and Australia, and actually, you do get that basic right to have an access to a healthcare professional. But once again, I think this is my key point. I know it's not, standards have fallen really low. I'm not providing the type of care in my practice that I would like to, but that's not because I don't want to or that I'm being lazy. That is because I just don't have the tools to do it. There are not enough doctors. We advertise for a doctor to work in our practice, and we'll be lucky if we have one or two candidates who are able to do it. And once again, if they want to work for us, because they'll have the choice of wherever they want to work, what we've got to ask is, why is that happening? Why is it so unpopular to be a GP at the moment. And once again, I could argue that one of the reasons it is because you get announcements like this when all of a sudden we're now put at the blame game end of not providing the care we want. And you're right, it's not where it should be. I feel really bad for the general public that they don't have the right to a GP that I believe they should do.
But some of the points that you've been making, I think many people will agree with them. But as you rightfully mentioned, many of those things are long-term in terms of recruitment and getting to those fundamental issues. We have this backlog now that people are demanding the new Health Secretary provide answers for. So when she, for example, has pledged that or called for patients to be seen within 2 weeks, she has admitted that that could also be a video call or a phone call. So there is flexibility there. But surely we need answers now, not just things that will resolve these problems in 5-10 years.
Agreed. And I think that once again, that the big myth is that video calls and telephone calls somehow save time. They don't. I much prefer people to be in and out, because I think you learn a lot by eyeballing someone in your room. I'm in my room right now, than on a telephone call. I actually probably spend less time on a face-to-face appointment than a telephone or a video call now. But because but aside from that, what the government, if they really wanted to take this seriously, and they won't like the answer, is that they need to chuck some money at this short term. We need to perhaps buy in resources from the private sector to clear the backlog. We maybe need to buy in resources in general practice to clear the sort of general practice demand. We may need to sort of invest in mental health services. 1 in 3 patients that see me today will be suffering from some form of mental health problem, mostly low-level mental health problem, occasionally the higher ones. Now, once again, there are simple ways in the short term that you could deal with that. But once again, we're not prepared to do that. Instead, we're going to put arbitrary targets in, which are going to pits the general public against the health service about expectations not being met. And once again, I'm really sad about that.
And just very, very quickly, one-word answer if possible. Is it time to seriously look at further privatising the NHS?
Ish. That's my one-word answer.
OK, it's not a no then. Thank you very much, Dr Mike Smith, a GP in North London there.
No, very fascinating.
Quite frank there. I was expecting a no from him.
Well, I do think that maybe the problems are so fundamental now, and we are seeing these waiting times delayed and cancelled, serious illness appointments during COVID, that we might have to look at alternative models if we are to produce the kinds of care that is necessary, as you mentioned, for a democratic modern society.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of having to pay for what the NHS is at the moment. I think the taxpayer is not getting value for money at all. But there you go. Let us know what you think. gbviews@gbnews.uk. But after the break, the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee is due to announce their latest decision on interest rates today. So will we see the largest rate rise for 30 years? That's coming up after the weather.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
To each and every one of you.
for helping our great nation
find its voice.
we're absolutely everywhere.
across England, Scotland,
Wales and Northern Ireland. On TV,
on radio and online.
we're proud to be
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
On the Mark Steyn Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flop at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Steyn Show.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
Good morning, it's 10:25 and this is To The Point on GB News with Inaya Falarian Iman and myself, Mercy Moroki, on GB News. We're live on your TV, online and radio.
Yes, well, the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee is due to announce their latest decision on interest rates today. On the cards could be the largest rate rise for 30 years as the bank tries to curb inflation.
But this could cause problems for some people with mortgages and those wanting to get on the housing ladder for the first time. Our East Midlands reporter Will Hollis has more.
A cost of living crisis, out of control inflation, and now, quite possibly, the biggest interest rates hike in a generation. A tough time to be searching for your first home. Lewis, a mortgage broker from Mansfield, helps new buyers make that first step.
12 months ago, the mortgage payment on that mortgage could have been eminently affordable. But of course, that may be not the case now.
An interest rate rise means you'll be paying back more on mortgages and other loans. It can make it much harder to get onto the property ladder. Lewis manages the deals between his clients and lenders. An interest increase can cause that to collapse.
Often we'll get very little notice that deals are going to be withdrawn, and as such you might get consumers and customers wanting to kind of jump on and try and secure deals before they're pulled. That creates a lot of stress, a lot of tension. There's always a lot of emotion because it's around money, it's around the property, it's an emotive subject.
Right now the bank rate of interest is 1.75%. It could jump to 2.5%. That base rate sets a standard, but lender interest rates will head higher. It could lead to millions of people across the country spending hundreds of pounds more on their mortgages each year. In the last year, the Bank of England has slowly been increasing interest rates in an effort to bring down inflation. The idea is that people will save more of their money and spend less of it. But that can make things much harder for people that do need to borrow cash. Richard works for the debt charity Step Change. He says the cost of living crisis is the #1 reason for people seeking help.
Immediately, this is going to be felt by homeowners, particularly those on variable mortgages. About 1 in 7 of the clients who come to Step Change for help with problem debt own their home and have a mortgage. So that will be felt quite immediately by some of those households. And further down the line, we can expect those interest rates to be passed on to higher consumer credit borrowing for people as well, who are relying on credit cards or other types of borrowing to get by during such difficult times.
This week, the government announced support for businesses to back up the tens of billions already pledged for households' energy costs. Tomorrow, there's a mini budget. It comes as inflation drops by a fraction, but remains at heights not seen since the 1980s. For now, financial support doesn't solve the problem, it only sedates it. Will Hollis for GB News in the East Midlands.
For more analysis, we're joined in the studio by our business and economics editor, Liam Halligan, with On the Money.
For joining us, Liam, tell us, what does this mean for people at home?
Well, what we're going to see today at 12 o'clock is the 8th successive interest rate rise by the Bank of England. The interest rate that the Bank of England sets will go from 1.75 possibly to 2.25, possibly even to 2.5%. If it's 2.5%, that will be, 0.75%, 75 basis points. That will be the biggest increase for several decades, as you said in your introduction. And this means that if you've got a variable rate mortgage, and millions of households are on variable rate mortgages, or they're on fixes that the fixes end in a year or two, so then they'll be exposed to variable rates. Your mortgage is about to get more expensive. If you've got a personal loan on a variable rate, that's going to get more expensive. On the other hand, and we should always point this out when we talk about interest rates, A lot of people live on their savings, particularly older people. And if the banks pass on these interest rate rises in full, a big if, they always drag their feet about it, like a lot of the petrol companies drag their feet about lowering petrol costs when oil prices come down, then in theory at least, savers should get more interest on their savings.
Yeah, I think you've hit on a point we were just discussing, actually, which is a generational divide, because, you know, arguably this will hit younger people who are perhaps trying to get on the housing ladder. Things are already tough for them now. Yes, they might benefit from fixed-rate mortgages for a few years, but it's still very difficult to get on the housing ladder.
It really is. I've taken an interest in this subject my whole sort of journalistic career. It is really difficult for young people to get on the housing ladder, particularly in London and the South East, where big chunks of the economy are. When I bought my first property in the late 90s, the average house in the UK was around 4 times the average annual wage. That figure's now 9 or 10 times, and that's a UK-wide figure. So in London and the South East, it's even higher. It's really hard to get a deposit together. You often need a deposit of, you know, tens of thousands of pounds. And a lot of families where if you're trying to become the first property owner in your family, you don't come from an owner-occupied family, then that's very, very difficult to get that money together. And there's a bit of a double whammy here for people looking to get on the housing ladder. Not only higher interest rates that are about to come in as the Bank of England tries to bear down on inflation, but there's talk that in his mini budget tomorrow, Kwasi Kwarteng, the new Chancellor, is going to lower stamp duty, even abolish or freeze stamp duty for a while. That's going to push house prices up as people move to take advantage of doing housing deals without stamp duty, particularly if they say this is only a temporary freeze. And that will make life more difficult, particularly for younger people trying to get on the housing ladder.
I mean, is there anything that ordinary people can do right now to reduce their costs? I mean, it does feel that, you know, people say you need to be resilient and to tighten your belts and all these types of things, but it does seem that it's so hard to know what to do at this point.
I agree with you, and I think a lot of the political media class can sound pretty glib when they talk about the cost of living crisis. Obviously, we're seeing the government making huge moves. The business support package yesterday announced by the business secretary for firms facing spiralling energy costs, that only lasts 6 months. The household support package, an enhanced household support package on top of the extra benefits that Rishi Sunak announced when he was Chancellor, that comes in on Friday. That will cap the average combined electricity and gas bill at about £2,500 a year. That's still much more than people were paying this time last year, and it will hit many households. There is extra support on top of that. Every household gets a £400 grant for their fuel. Vulnerable households on certain benefits will get another £650. There's additional benefits for people with disabilities because they often need more energy, more heating, more power for equipment and so on. But these are really tough times, and the government now is saying that's why we are trying to boost growth. That's why we want to lower taxes to get the economy moving, to build prosperity. But that's very, very controversial. A lot of people think borrowing more at a time and lowering taxes at the same time is fiscally irresponsible.
And roughly what time do we know? What will we know for sure today?
The Bank of England will make its announcement at 12 noon today, and Kwasi Kwarteng's mini budget, nothing mini about it. It will be a very, very important and much scrutinised announcement. That's at 9:30 tomorrow morning, Mercy. We've got special programming here on GB News.
OK, fantastic. Thank you, Liam. I know you'll be back for more analysis across the channel all day. Well, after the break, we'll be talking about fracking. Very controversial. Is this a necessary measure to tackle the cost of living crisis? The government thinks it will be. Or is it actually just inappropriate for the UK? Well, let us know what you think. GBViews at gbnews.uk. We'll look into that after this morning's headlines.
Good morning, it's 10:34. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Patients in England will be expected to get an appointment with their GP within 2 weeks under plans to be unveiled by the new Health Secretary this morning. Under the reforms, it's also thought Therese Coffey will pledge patients with urgent needs will be seen on the same day. It's part of a drive to improve access to doctors' appointments as she unveils her NHS plans for this winter and next. The Bank of England is expected to unveil the biggest hike in interest rates for over 3 decades this morning. The Monetary Policy Committee is expected to increase rates by up to 0.75 percentage points. That means a potential interest rate of 2.5%, which would be the highest the UK's seen since the 2008 financial crisis. The government has lifted a ban on fracking in England in a bid to increase what it calls homegrown sources of energy. Unveiling the measures, Business Secretary Jacob Rees-Mogg said the government needed to pursue all avenues to provide energy security. It's thought the plans could lead to over 100 new licences being issued across the country, despite concerns the practice could cause earthquakes. A 16-year-old boy has been arrested on suspicion of murder in connection with the death of a 15-year-old boy who was stabbed to death in Huddersfield yesterday. An investigation has been launched after the teenager died in hospital following an attack close to the entrance of North Huddersfield Trust School. The head teacher says they've lost a wonderful student from their school community. And a spectacular new image of Neptune has been released by NASA. The James Webb Space Telescope has captured the clearest view yet of the planet, seen for the first time in infrared light. It's the most comprehensive look at Neptune's rings in 3 decades. TV online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound will buy you $1.132 and €1.146. The price of gold currently stands at £1,477.03 per ounce.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
To each and every one of you.
for helping our great nation
Find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Across England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. On TV,
On radio and online.
we're proud to be
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
On the Mark Steyn Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flop at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Steyn Show.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
with myself, Mercy Moroki, and Inaya Falarin Iman on GB News. We're live on your TV, online and radio, as always.
Now, big debate. The government have today lifted the ban on fracking in a bid to boost domestic energy supply. Business Secretary Jacob Rees-Mogg said, quote, "In light of Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine and weaponization of energy, strengthening our energy security is an absolute priority. And as the Prime Minister said, we are going to ensure the UK is a net energy exporter by 2040.
Well, however, some people are concerned about both the safety of fracking and whether it will actually deliver a reduction in our energy bills. And we'd love to know what you think about this ban being lifted. So get in touch with your views, gbviews@gbnews.uk is the email. But in the meantime, we have two guests with opposing views on the subject. We're going to do a proper pro and con analysis of fracking. We've got Harry Wilkinson, who's head of policy for Net Zero Watch and supports the ban being lifted, and Laurie Laybourne, who's an economist, and he's opposed to any lifting on restrictions.
Well, thank you both for joining us on the programme. Laurie, I'll start with you. I mean, having done a bit of research on fracking, I mean, it is something that is used in America, and it has been quite fundamentally game-changing. In 2013, America's fracking revolution helped the United States become the #1 producer of oil and natural gas in the world. And now that we've got an illegal invasion of Ukraine, surely fracking could be part of that solution to being energy secure. Why do you oppose it?
Because we're not the US. The US is very large. The geology of where it is ground, where it can extract the shale gas, is completely different to ours. We've got a sort of complex web of geology in this country that makes it far more difficult in the US. It's like under the ground in the US, you've got sort of big sort of reservoirs of this stuff that we're able to get out. In the UK, it's much more piecemeal, it's much more difficult. But even if we could, and it's much harder, so that's off the table anyway, but even if it was as easy as it is, say, in the US, the size of the UK is still relatively small to the size of the US. It's like having a farm that's producing milk, a small farm, trying to change the entire milk price for the UK by producing more milk. So the weight in what is an international market in gas, the UK's weight in that is just not going to shift the price. So it's just something that we can't compare ourselves to the US. And even if we were able to get good quality frack gas out in the UK, and we were able to do that within the space of a few years, which we can't, it's not going to be a solution to the problems that we face.
Harry, let's go to you. Do you accept that analysis and that analogy indeed there, and this argument that actually we can't make a like-for-like comparison as to the efficacy of fracking when it comes to the US versus the UK?
Well, it's true that the conditions in the UK will be different, no doubt, from America. But I think this debate has become quite confused. People are saying, well, how much of a difference will it make? However, we don't ban whole industries, on the basis of predictions which may be wrong or not. We actually have to be looking at all ways possible to expand the supply of gas at the present moment. We're in an energy crisis. It's right that there's support for families, for businesses, to get through that from the government, but that's a sticking plaster, and we're all paying for it. Through government borrowing, which is going to mount up potentially into hundreds of billions of pounds. This is not a sustainable solution. The only way that we can get gas prices down is to increase the supply. So we have to be looking at all ways that we can do that. And a ban in this context, a ban on our own shale gas resources, seems completely baffling. We need to do the tests here in the UK to find out how successful it can be. Many people in the industry are quite encouraged by what's been done so far, and so we need to see more testing take place to really see if this can be a useful solution.
Yeah, Laurie, what do you say to those points? Because many people would say, well, we'll agree with Harry saying, why have we kind of picked winners and losers? I mean, we had a moratorium on nuclear as well, and we had a ban on fracking, and we know that when it comes to solar and wind, when the wind isn't blowing, when the sun isn't shining, they aren't producing the kinds of energy we need. And therefore, we should have a range of diverse sources in order to actually supply the demand that we have.
Yeah, and I would agree with that about having a range of diverse sources. It's about choosing the ones that are most effective in, as we're hearing there, bringing down the energy prices that we face. Again, the market in gas is an international market. So unless you are a massive supplier of gas, like Russia or like the US, you're not going to be able to change that international gas price. So if you were able to get frack gas out of the ground in the UK, which, as I've said, is very difficult because of the geology, is very difficult as well because of the politics here. Like, we have to admit that people don't want this happening in their local area. And it would be very interesting to see if Liz Truss and if Jacob Rees-Mogg are the MPs who are at the front of the queue putting their hands up and saying, oh, let's try it in our constituencies. I doubt that will happen.
Yeah. I was going to say, if they are going to give local communities a say, then if people choose to have it, then I suppose that is their choice. And some communities very much might do, especially if they're getting a discount, as has been touted, on that energy supply.
And jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So agreed. But again, they're being misled if they're being told that getting fracked gas out of the ground in the UK is easy, which it's not, and that will shift the gas price down. Again, this is an international market. It's got nothing to do, my opposite to this has largely got nothing to do with climate change. It's got nothing to do really with things about earthquakes. As we saw with the latest British Geological Survey report the government released today, we're still quite unsure about that. My opposition to it is that it's a market argument. The economics don't work. The gas price is international. And therefore, if you get gas out of the ground in the UK, which is very difficult to do, it won't shift the price down. So to help people with their bills, you may as well spend the money and the time on insulating those homes so they use less energy. The best thing to do.
Let's bring Harry in and just to answer that. Harry, Laurie says the economics don't work.
Well, I mean, what we see is not international gas markets, but actually regional gas markets. In North America, where they have done a lot of fracking, natural gas prices are perhaps only a fifth of what we're paying here. So they've been paying much, much less than we have. Now, fracking is one part of the solution. We've got to be opening up the supply taps where we can. The net zero agenda has been denying many projects, and that could be the Groningen gas field in the Netherlands, for example, Europe's largest gas field that's being closed down. Why are we saying no to all of these projects when we need to be getting the cost of energy down? We're in a war with Russia, and actually our polling at Net Zero Watch actually showed that more of the public were in favour of lifting the ban rather than keeping the ban in place, 44 to 36%. So actually this idea that it's so unpopular is not actually borne out by the results that we've found.
And Laurie, I mean, you say that your argument's a market argument, but ultimately that has the climate change argument has been the one that has effectively led the government and other business leaders and so on to shy away from actually pursuing various different energy sources that could have provided us with security and supply right now. So what do you make of those arguments, the climate change argument?
Well, I think that's what the climate change arguments are in many ways sound. We need to be switching to an energy system that doesn't kick out planet-heating gases, which are causing all sorts of chaos globally. But I do think the economic argument has been the main thing that has been dwelling on these people's minds. And you don't need to take it from me about this economic argument. Google now Quadrilla. So this is a company that was originally pushing for fracking, still is. And comment piece, and you will see on Google a comment piece written by the former chief exec, the guy who was pushing fracking in the UK, saying it doesn't work in this country, partly because of that economic argument. And on your point about climate change, about 10 years ago, David Cameron said we should get rid of the green crap, and that meant there was a massive drop in investment in some renewable energy technologies and in insulation. And I will tell you this now, analysis shows that if we had kept up those insulation programs, by now, households would have been saving £168 on their energy bills, and by January, that would have gone up to £220.
Well, thank you both for joining us. Laurie Labourne, economist, and Harry Wilkinson, head of policy at Net Zero Watch. And it is interesting you mentioned those points about David Cameron, because there is also a video floating around on Twitter of Nick Clegg in 2010, basically shutting down a new nuclear power station, saying that it wouldn't be created until 10 years.
Yeah, I think we can all agree if we'd have done things before, we wouldn't be in as bad as a position as we are at the moment. But thank you both. Interesting discussion there.
Yeah, well, in another important story that is doing the rounds today is extra police officers are being brought into Leicester to prevent a repeat of intercommunal violence which erupted last weekend.
Yes, well, the region's police and crime commissioner says this weekend neighbouring forces are providing additional officers to help with the issue. Well, let's speak to our home and security editor, Mark White, who joins us from Leicester now. Good morning, Mark. So talk to us about this, because I'm still not quite clear what's been going on. Is this violence contained in those streets, in that part of Leicester, or has it been spreading to other areas of the country?
Well, it has spread to a few areas of Leicester, and we did see tensions spill over in Smethwick to the west of Birmingham just earlier this week as well, following reports that a controversial speaker was due to speak at a Hindu temple there. They were cancelled, but that still brought out 300-odd young Muslim men who surrounded that temple for a while before police dispersed them. There is real concern about the potential for this intercommunal violence spreading. You speak to people within the communities here, interestingly, they say that actually they are blaming an influx of recent immigrants from the Indian subcontinent who haven't integrated in the same way as second generation Asians have in this very multicultural city, and they say they bring with them a lot of the extremist views that are currently rife on the Indian subcontinent. As you said, the police will have reinforcements. They have forces in the surrounding area. Other neighbouring police forces have officers on standby to help this weekend, because of course the weekends are key areas of concern, key times of concern. We saw the violent disorder last weekend, and previous weekends also saw disorder. I've been taking a closer look at the communities here and about the potential for more disorder in the days and weeks ahead. On Belgrave Road in Leicester, the scene of so much of the violence in recent days, it's peaceful now. The predominantly Hindu community is preparing for the annual Diwali festival next month. But for now, locals like Rakan Chudasama, who's run a retail business here for 20 years, is more concerned about the next few days, fearing the possibility of renewed trouble here.
It's minority who is causing the problem. I mean, Hindus and Muslims, at the end of the day, we are all one. So I don't see why they should be fighting.
Last weekend's violence here stretched local policing resources beyond breaking point. Senior officers had to call on mutual aid from neighbouring forces to help bring order back to the community. The area's Police and Crime Commissioner says reinforcements will be in place in the days ahead should trouble flare again.
Some of the officers are beginning to get tired, that they're needing to take rests. But the neighbouring police forces have been absolutely wonderful. They have not stinted in sending us additional officers, together with all the equipment that they need. So yeah, absolutely, there will be enough police officers out there to cope with whatever comes.
The violence here between young Hindu and Muslim men flared up after a cricket match between India and Pakistan on the 28th of August. Both sides, of course, blame each other, and social media has only intensified the anger and unrest. The violence here is a huge blow to Leicester's reputation as one of the country's most ethnically diverse, yet largely harmonious communities. A city that has always proudly boasted of its multicultural heritage. Suleiman Nagdi from the Federation of Muslim Organisations in Leicester believes a recent surge in immigrants from the subcontinent has added to the volatility within settled and, to an extent, integrated communities here.
In recent years, we've had a new migration that's come in over the last 4 or 5 years. Now, I don't wish to stereotype a particular section of the community, but that community came from a different background, and therefore their understanding and the norms of British society may be different to that of mine. And I think we have not built the bridge between that community and ourselves, and hence I think the problem lies at every section of society.
Despite the calls for calm, it's clear that below the surface there are those prepared to exploit ancient animosities and import the kind of interfaith intolerance that has so divided much of the Indian subcontinent. Mark White, GB News, Leicester.
Well, that is our Home and Security Editor, Mark White, bringing us updates on the riots and violence that have been unfolding in Leicester and spreading to different parts of the country. And I mean, my views are on it, we were just talking about that just a moment ago, is that we should have absolutely zero tolerance for this kind of behaviour. And I think, you know, I do think that the people enacting this behaviour have responsibility, but undoubtedly, I think for a long time there has been a reluctance amongst the political class in Britain to talk openly and honestly about issues around women's rights, around issues around freedom of speech and basic liberal values, and the way in which there has been a fundamental lack of integration and assimilation into a wider British culture. And I think that this does also contribute to social fragmentation and the sense that people can get away with this kind of behaviour and there will be no response. There'll be no accountability, and that's unacceptable.
Yeah, it's certainly, I completely agree with you. There is a hesitancy, isn't there, when it comes to discussing these issues, you know, especially when it's to do with religion, especially when it's to do with ethnic minorities. Nobody wants to sort of speak up for fear of being labelled racist or ignorant or Islamophobic or, you know, whatever it is. We do really want to go to some of your views, and we will be doing so because you've been getting in touch and lots of interesting views on fracking, on the NHS. So we will be getting to those in just a moment, we promise, and keep them coming in, gbviews@gbnews.uk. But for now, we're going to take a break.
Hello, I'm Aidan McGibbon from the Met Office. Rain in places, primarily central parts of the UK, so northern England, parts of Wales as well through the rest of the day. Drier to the south and to the north of that rain because it's all down to a cold front which is slicing the country in two. It brought rain to Scotland and Northern Ireland overnight. That wet weather still across southern Scotland, but it's now pushing into northern England, north and west Wales, and really, it's a slow-moving feature, and that rain will be heavy and steady at times, especially over the hills of North Wales and northwest England. Also fairly damp for parts of eastern Scotland until the end of the afternoon, but brighter skies to the far northwest for Northern Ireland, as well as for southern parts of England, and it's in the south where we'll see the highest temperatures, 21 or 22 Celsius, mid to high teens elsewhere. Now, through the evening, the area of cloud and rain sinks south. It turns more showery, so the rain will be on and off, but there'll still be some heavy bursts at times, reaching the southeast by dawn. Clearer skies for northern England, parts of Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland later on. 1 or 2 showers still in the far northwest. And a cooler night to come, where we've got those clearer skies, temperatures dipping into the mid-single figures. But a mild start to the day for the southeast, and that's where we keep the cloud and some showery rain, some heavy showers at times as well. Elsewhere, a brighter day to come with sunny spells, but further showers, I think, for Scotland, Northern Ireland, as well as parts of northern England. 18 to 19 Celsius in the north. I think still the potential for 20 Celsius in the far south, depending on how much brightness we see coming through. And the rain will be heavy at times, though, and we'll continue to see that through Friday night for the far southeast. Clearer skies elsewhere and a cool start to the day on Saturday. Further showers in places on Saturday, but some sunshine in between.
It's a big week for the economy, with likely interest rate rises and a raft of government announcements. On Friday, Newbie Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng unveils a mini budget that will be anything but mini, as ministers move to help millions of cash-strapped households cope with spiralling utility bills. Join us on GB News from tomorrow morning and throughout the day for all the sharpest news, views and insights into what this vital budget statement means for you and your family on GB News, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
to each and every one of you
for helping our great nation
find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Across England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland.
On TV,
on radio
and online.
We're proud to be the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
On the Mark Steyn Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flop at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Steyn Show.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
GB News with me, Mercy Moroki, and Inaya Falarin Iman on your TV, online and radio.
We're with you until midday with all of the updates on today's big stories, including those impending announcements by the new Health Secretary and the latest on the Migrant Channel crossing, and also even cannabis sweets. That's all coming up.
Yes, we'll tell you all about that. Make sure you get in touch with your views, gbviews at gbnews.uk, and we'll get to those very shortly. But first, here's your latest headlines.
Good morning, it's 1 minute past 11. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Patients in England will be expected to get an appointment with their GP within 2 weeks under new plans to be unveiled by the new Health Secretary this morning. Under the reforms, it's also expected Therese Coffey will pledge patients with urgent needs will be seen on the same day. It's part of a drive to improve access to doctors' appointments as she unveils her NHS plan for this winter and next.
One of the things that I want to do is to not be prescriptive with GPs in how they interact with their patients, but to make sure that those service levels or expectations are met. And we want to work on a local NHS level to make sure that those practices that aren't meeting that expectation of patients being able to see a GP within 2 weeks, how we can help them do that.
Meanwhile, the Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting told GB News an NHS workforce plan should be a top priority.
Unless we recruit more doctors and nurses, unless there's a workforce plan for the NHS, there just isn't a plan for the NHS. And what really worries me is that this is our third health secretary in 6 months. And I've not seen any sign in the newspapers that she's planning to grip that particular issue. Unless we recruit those doctors and nurses, more people will leave the profession. That means longer waits, worse care, and I think people are sick and tired of waiting.
The Bank of England is expected to unveil the biggest hike in interest rates for over 3 decades this morning. The Monetary Policy Committee is expected to increase rates by up to 0.75 percentage points. That means a potential interest rate of 2.5%, which would be the highest the UK's seen since the 2008 financial crisis. The government has lifted a ban on fracking in England in a bid to increase what it calls homegrown sources of energy. Unveiling the measures, Business Secretary Jacob Rees-Mogg said the government needed to pursue all avenues to provide energy security. It's thought the plans could lead to over 100 new licences being issued across the country, despite concerns the practice could cause earthquakes. Liz Truss had previously defended potentially breaching a Conservative manifesto pledge by lifting the ban. A 16-year-old boy has been arrested on suspicion of murder in connection with the death of a 15-year-old boy who was stabbed to death in Huddersfield yesterday. An investigation has been launched after the teenager died in hospital following an attack close to the entrance of North Huddersfield Trust School. The head teacher says they've lost a wonderful student from their school community. Catholics outnumber Protestants in Northern Ireland for the first time since the partition of the island. The latest census figures show 45.7% of the population are either Catholic or brought up as Catholic, compared to 43.5% Protestant. The census has also showed an increase of over 60% in the number of people who hold an Irish passport. Liz Truss has described Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine as a catastrophic failure in her first address before world leaders as Prime Minister. It came just hours after President Putin threatened to use nuclear weapons, warning he wasn't bluffing. He's calling up more than 300,000 military reservists to fight, which has sparked protests in cities across Russia. Meanwhile, 5 Brits captured whilst fighting alongside Ukrainians are among the 10 foreign nationals freed by Russian-backed forces. Aidan Aslin, John Harding and Sean Pinner, along with 2 more unidentified UK citizens, had been held captive for months. They've been released as part of a prisoner swap brokered by Saudi Arabia. And a spectacular new image of Neptune has been released by NASA. The James Webb Space Telescope has captured the clearest view yet of the planet, seen for the first time in infrared light. It's the most comprehensive look at Neptune's rings. More as it happens now, though, let's return. Naya Mercy with To The Point.
Good morning, this is To The Point on GB News with me, Anaya Falarin Iman and Mercy Moroki on your TV, radio and online. Here's what's coming up on the final hour.
Yes, Health Secretary Therese Coffey will announce plans to tackle the NHS backlog very shortly. We're expecting that in about an hour and a half. She said that it's expected that people should not be waiting any longer than 2 weeks for a GP appointment. Those are some of the measures she'll set out. We'll be speaking to a GP on this a bit later.
Yes, and another story, cannabis sweets are being packaged to look like Haribo or Skittles in brightly coloured packaging with fake branding attracting children to eat them. 6 children have been taken to hospital as a result of this. We'll be discussing it later on in the show.
And it's apparently car-free day today, which is encouraging people around the world to find alternatives to using their cars. Environmental campaigners are now calling on the Scottish Government to meet their target of cutting car use by 20%. But is this really possible? Should people just be getting on with their lives and not being told whether or not they can use their car? Let us know what you think.
Indeed. Well, we have all that coming up across the programme, so make sure you get in touch with your views as usual, gbviews at gbnews.uk.
Now, the Health Secretary, Therese Coffey, will today announce a new plan to tackle NHS backlogs in the run-up to winter. She said she'll be announcing those plans very soon. We're expecting them at around 12:30. NHS own data shows not a single trust in England met the A&E waiting time targets during the year from April 2021 to March this year.
Yes, well, earlier today, the Health Secretary told Breakfast with Stephen and Isabel that patients were her top priority.
Top priority that I set out in our plan for patients is patients, and I'm covering in a variety of ways the things where patients rely most on access to the NHS, and that's actually through primary care. And that's why I've set out a clear expectation that when people phone up the surgery, first of all they get through, but also that they also can get an appointment certainly within a fortnight, and for urgent cases, which many GPs are already brilliant at doing, getting that same day appointment so they can immediately get access to the care that they desperately need.
The new Health Secretary, Therese Coffey, there. Well, let's hear what Labour's Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, had to say this morning on GP appointment waiting times.
Yeah, we'll see what the Health Secretary says, but I've got to say, after 12 years in government, I think it's outrageous, actually, to present a 2-week wait to see a GP as good news for patients. When we were in government, we guaranteed GP access within 48 hours, just 2 days. We've got the biggest crisis in the history of the NHS, much of it a mess of the government's own making. And I think at this stage, after 12 years, expecting the Conservatives to deal with the NHS crisis is a bit like expecting the arsonists to put out the fire they created. It's not going to happen. And the longer they're in government, the longer patients will wait.
That was the Shadow Health Secretary there, West Streeting. Well, let's now talk to our political reporter, Catherine Forster. Thank you for joining us on this second hour, Catherine. What do you think this new plan will include?
Well, we know some of what's going to be talked about by Therese Coffey in just over an hour. I'm outside St Thomas's Hospital, which is just on the south bank of the Thames. Over on the other side is the Houses of Parliament. What we know is specifically she's going to try to make it easier to see GPs. Of course, that is a massive issue for people who recently, since the pandemic especially, haven't been able to get to see their GP when they've needed, and often have ended up either not going and then conditions have got worse, or have ended up going to A&E. So the government is setting an expectation. You will be able to see a GP within 2 weeks. If it is urgent, you should be seen on the same day. Some of the reasons how they're going to do this have been set out in terms of they're hoping to free up about 3 million appointments. I should say that's only 1% of the total, by using pharmacists to prescribe particular drugs, to take A&E referrals, using nurse practitioners, using GP assistants to take some of the workload from GPs. But of course, the NHS is much more than just being able to see your GP. Apparently, she is making plans for A, B, C, D, we're told, ambulances, backlogs, care, doctors and dentists. There's some expectation that she may announce £500 million for social care. Obviously, she is not just department head for NHS, but also social care. Social care has been neglected over many years. And of course, 1 in 8 people in hospital shouldn't be there, doesn't want to be there, but is simply there because they can't be sent home safely. They need care in the community, care to convalesce, social care, which simply is not in place. But the figures that we've heard earlier this summer, clearly the NHS really is in crisis. You know, terrible figures for ambulance waits, for backlogs. So NHS bosses will be really hoping for some real action and rather more than warm words and sound bites when Therese Coffey gets up to speak a little bit after 12 today.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine Forster, our political reporter, bringing us updates just then about the announcements that Theresa Coffey, the new Health Secretary, is planning to make very soon, in the next hour and a half or so, on the NHS.
Yeah, let's go to some of your views for the meantime. Lots of you obviously have strong views about the NHS. It's something that affects us all. Martin says, the last lot of money that the NHS was given, they hired a load of diversity managers. He thinks they should stop wasting money on things like that. I mean, you know, it is a drop in the ocean, I should say. The amount
I still think it's a good point.
Yeah, it is. It is a good point. Paul says, stop treating people that turn up on our shores from around the world.
Oh, I don't know.
That's not what you do in a civil country.
In line with international law. But I think interesting on the point about other people coming from other countries. I mean, when we talk about the lack of NHS doctors and nurses and so on, we do talk about recruiting people abroad. But also, what effect does that have on crippling health services in poorer countries if all of those doctors and nurses that they need, which is very few already, are coming to the UK in order to support our system? That's a really big challenge as well.
Well, another big issue we've been discussing is fracking, and the government has to date lifted that ban on fracking.
Coincides with the government.
Live to Parliament where they're discussing that now.
Mr. Speaker, in relation to Quadrilla, the gentleman in question, I believe, left the company 10 years ago, so he's somewhat out of date in terms of the company, that he purports to represent. The current management of Quadrilla are in favour of this. I think local support is important, and one of the things the companies who want to drill for shale gas will have to do will come up with packages that are attractive to local communities, and that, I think, ensures that people actually get some financial reward from shale gas being extracted near them.
Ruth Edmonds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to press my right honourable friend further on this issue of how community support is going to be defined and measured, because I have many concerned constituents who want to know that they have a genuine route to rejecting fracking applications that don't have local support, and I'm still not clear what that would be.
Mr. Speaker, there are parts of the country, particularly in relation to nuclear, where local consent and support is very enthusiastic for the development of additional energy sites. So it is perfectly possible to measure and see local support.
Bill Leicester.
The homes of people living near to the Altcar Moss proposed fracking site shook as a result of the tests that he referred to earlier. The Secretary of State said shale gas was safe, but his government paid compensation to residents living near fracking sites in Lancashire. This government's own report says little progress has been made in reducing and predicting the risks. When is he finally going to admit that fracking is a non-starter in this country?
Well, in relation to seismic activity, there is no particular similarity with that from mining, and that mining is not subject to seismic limits.
Sir Greg Knight.
Mr. Speaker, despite what he said, is it not the case that forecasting the occurrence of seismic events as a result of fracking remains a challenge to the experts? Is it not therefore creating a risk of an unknown quantity to pursue shale gas exploration at the present time?
Yes.
Is he aware the safety of the public is not a currency in which some of us choose to speculate?
Mr. Speaker, unusually I disagree with my right honourable friend that it is all a matter of proportionality, and that, as I pointed out, the movement on the ground level that we have from construction is more than double is about double that we have had from any instance with shale gas. So we know what has happened before. There are not limits on mining. There are not limits on ordinary oil extraction. It is only shale gas that has these limits, and there is no evidence that shale gas is worse than any of these other activities. So I think on a balance of risks, my right honourable friend is not coming to the right conclusion.
Dame Angela Riedel.
Much, Mr. Speaker. I take it a bit rich from the self-styled minister for the 19th century that he thinks the CEO of Quadrilla is out of date. His manifesto said that we will not support fracking unless the science shows categorically that it can be done safely. Exactly. The science has not proved categorically that it can be done safely. So he is reneging on his solemn promise, which all of them stood on, to the British people in 2019. This is not a legitimate thing for this government to do, is it?
Mr. Speaker, we must reiterate, or I must reiterate, that the former Chief Executive of Quadrilla resigned 10 years ago. He does not represent the company, and that is important, and the House would be put under a misapprehension if it were to think that he were currently involved. As regards the last manifesto, I happily stood on the last manifesto because I had read the 2012 report that went through most of the myths against shale gas and showed that they were wrong and that the extraction of shale gas is safe.
Scott Benton.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State will be aware of the strong objections which many of my constituents have to fracking. The Prime Minister has been quite clear in saying it will only take place if there is strong local support for it. However, this poses many questions. What is a local community and how do you define that? How do you ascertain whether or not it can command local support? And what incentives, if any, are going to be provided to local communities to have fracking imposed upon them? My constituents are understandably anxious about fracking returning to the Foul Coast. And so when will they receive an answer to some of these questions?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend asks a very important question, because it is important for the national interest that we have secure supplies of gas. That is something important across the House to all constituents. But this will affect some residents much, much more than others, and therefore it is only right that they are compensated and that they receive some financial benefit for the inconvenience that they will have. Now, I would say to my honourable friend that the majority of the inconvenience does not actually come from the extraction of shale gas, but it comes from the building of the shale gas well in the first place and the lorry movements that are associated with that. And it is important that people benefit and are rewarded for doing something that is in the national interest.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, what studies has the Secretary of State taken of the effect on aquifers where fracking has taken place that are deeply polluted and run well beyond the local community that he's seeking the support for to introduce fracking back into this country? Surely he must understand the dangers of this are going to be here for decades and decades to come, long after whatever small amounts of gas have been extracted, and it's future generations that will suffer because of this policy.
Mr. Speaker, it's no surprise that I disagree with the right honourable gentleman. I would refer him to the 2012 report that was done that went through this and went through what had happened in the United States for comparison purposes. First of all, it found that the evidence on pollution of aquifers was not actually any good, that most of the stories were invented or were scare stories. But in addition to that, the UK has a very good regulatory regime. So the combination of ignoring the scare stories and decent regulation means that one can be confident that aquifers will not be damaged.
Robert Sims.
Could I welcome this announcement? It's one of the few from the front bench which actually will make us a lot richer if we pursue this. It will also make us more resilient in a very difficult world. But the key seems to me what advantage those communities that may be affected can get in terms of financial support. And has the Secretary of State had any discussions with the Treasury? Because it seems to me that if local people do give their consent, it's in the national interest.
I'm very grateful. My honourable friend makes exactly the right point, both ways round, that this is in the national interest, will make the country richer, but it's absolutely right that those affected should be rewarded. And to my mind, that is direct financial reward, not a theoretical one. The last time we discussed fracking, the idea was that communities would be delighted if they got £10 for the village hall. I don't think that's the right way to do it. It needs to be direct to the individuals who are affected, and I've had preliminary discussions with my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, but I don't have a formal thing to announce.
Helen Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Residents in the northern part of my constituency are rightly concerned about the impact of tremors on their often older buildings, and they're worried about the impact of the extraction of coal bed methane through fracking on their rural way of life. Can the Secretary of State explain in detail, which he hasn't done so far, exactly the mechanism that communities will be able to refuse to allow their consent for coal bed extraction and shale gas fracking? Because compensation is not consent.
Yeah. Well, compensation and consent become two sides of the same coin, that people will be able to negotiate the level of compensation, and it will be a matter for the companies to try and ensure widespread consent by offering a compensation package that is attractive. Do you know, Mr. Speaker, the other side, they howl and wail about this, because actually we're trying to use market forces. It's amazing, a Conservative government using market forces.
Andrew Bridget.
Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree with me that we should have been fracking our shale gas 2 years ago, but we are where we are, and now the best available time to start is immediately?
Rubbish. Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend says only 2 years ago. Why such a short time frame?
Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's own figures show only 70% of the public support fracking. 3,000 people in Barnsley signed a petition against it. There is no local consent where I represent. And given the last round of fracking licences were in Yorkshire, how will the Secretary of State ensure that northern communities are not disproportionately affected by this outdated and dangerous way to create energy?
Well, it's definitely not outdated. It's a very effective and modern way of extracting energy. And what I would say to people is, do they want cheaper and more secure energy or not? And if the answer is yes, then fracking is going to be part of the answer.
Jerome Mayhew.
Speaker, the Secretary of State has made repeated reference to a 2012 report which identified considerable potential reserves. How significant might these be in achieving energy security?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. It is an important and fundamental question. The answer is that we need to do the test drilling first to see whether these reserves can be achieved in the way that the 2012 report hoped. But I can't give a firm commitment on that because we haven't done enough test drilling yet.
Amy Callaghan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Coming back to the 2019 Tory Party manifesto, which each member opposite stood on, it states a moratorium on fracking would only be lifted, and I quote from page 55, unless science says it shows it can be done safely. A change in Tory party leadership is not a change in scientific evidence. Can the Secretary of State enlighten the House as to why the government thinks they are both above logic and above science?
Because all the evidence is that it can be done safely, as it is in the United States, and as the 2012 report that I've referred to many times indicated.
Michael Fabricant.
Mr. Speaker, I've been quite shocked, actually, by the Luddites on the front bench who have been quite open in saying that they're going to weaponise this in a general election. So for those who fear the unknown, may I tell my right honourable friend that the 0.5 limit on the Richter scale is nothing compared to the 1.5 limit on the Richter scale, which Lichfield is currently enduring from pile driving for HS2. If we can live with that, though we don't really like living with that, Mr. Speaker, we can certainly enjoy the benefits from fracking.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes an absolutely right and wise point that the motto of right honourable members opposite for the next election is let's be cold and poor. That's really the prospectus they're putting before the British people. And as regards seismic activity, there are millions of seismic events of 2.5 or lower in the world every year. We should not assume that every seismic event is the San Francisco earthquake.
John Warren.
Mr. Speaker, lifting the cap on bankers' bonuses, whilst at the same time making it harder for working people to access benefits. Now lifting the safety limits on seismic events or earthquakes to you and me, whilst at the same time protecting, indeed subsidising, oil companies' excessive profits, as well as accelerating climate change. Doesn't this decision really show whose side this Tory government is on?
His Majesty's government is on the side of people who need energy, and of business that needs energy, and of an economy that needs to grow. The party opposite are in favour of no growth, coldness and high prices.
Paul Maynard.
Visit to Costa Coffee on Tuesday morning rivaled the House of Commons chamber this morning for the robustness of debate, the strength of opinions expressed. I sought to reassure constituents that they would have the opportunity to have their say because local consent was required. Listening carefully to the Secretary of State this morning, I have yet to hear any explanation of how local consent will be determined, indeed an absence of any reference to local consent. So let me try once more. Will my constituents be asked whether they want fracking or not?
Mr. Speaker, as I've said and the Prime Minister said, we will be looking to have the support of local communities. That is important. And there will be a responsibility for the companies when they bring forward proposals to work out how they can get that local consent. And it seems to me pretty clear that that will involve giving money to people to encourage them because they will want to have the benefit locally whilst they are doing something that helps the country nationally.
Hal Williams.
Mr. Speaker, in Wales we know the cost of dangerous fossil fuel extraction so that others remotely can profit. It's particularly acute today, the date of the Gresford mining disaster, where 266 men and boys were killed, 200 women were widowed, 800 children were left fatherless. The coal mine, owned by the Westminster and the United Group, who subsequently destroyed the safety records. Mr. Speaker, Gresford was mooted as a fracking site, and there the men killed remain, by the way, 2,000 feet down. Only 11 bodies were recovered, but mooted as a fracking site. So, will the Secretary of State confirm that he understands that powers on fracking remain with our Senedd and that he has no intention of trying to return those powers to Westminster?
Mr. Speaker, I am not seeking to upset the devolution settlement.
Craig McKinnon.
Speaker, even before Putin's illegal war in Ukraine, fracking had advantages because of the benefit for jobs, investment, tax revenues and the balance of payments positivity, which I'd rather was accruing here in the UK rather than sending tens of billions to Qatar and other places. Now, is my right honourable friend aware of the CO2 savings of domestic energy supply? It has been calculated that there are 5 million tonnes of CO2 emitted just for the LNG process of cooling, decasification and also the transport. That has got to be a moral outrage.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right that he takes his argument through logically, unlike many people on the benches opposite. That if we wish to reduce carbon emissions, we are better off using gas as a transition fuel that comes from our own resources rather than importing it. That must be true. And we have those resources. We need the transition fuel. Therefore, we should try and extract it domestically.
John Trickey.
Mr. Speaker, and today's panicky Trumpian announcement is brought about because of the failure of successive Tory governments who squandered the opportunity which coal, oil and gas, our indigenous resources, offered to transform our economy into a carbon-free economy. Will the Secretary of State now confirm that on his target list...
Well, that was live footage from the House of Commons. They've been discussing fracking. The new Business Secretary, Jacob Rees-Mogg, has been taking questions from members of Parliament on that controversial issue. Of course, this comes after the government have announced that they will be lifting that moratorium on fracking, which pretty much came into force in 2019. Lots has been discussed, hasn't it? I think one particular point is that he's made it very clear that those who are affected, those who agree for fracking to come to their local area, so to speak, will definitely be rewarded, or he said should be rewarded directly.
Yeah, and I think that the themes that were coming out of the questions were very much about what about the democratic oversight?
Yeah.
And local communities have an opportunity to organise to oppose it or oppose it in some way if they don't want it in their local community. When Jacob Rees-Mogg, however, was arguing that it brings economic security and jobs for the economy. Make sure you send your views on that subject. We've had many coming in already.
Yes, indeed. He said extraction of shale gas is safe. Lots of MPs there obviously citing concerns not least to do with the seismic activity that was an issue before when fracking did used to take place before this ban was lifted, but he did emphasise that we need to do the test drilling first. So there will be lots of concerns around the safety of fracking that the government will have to address.
Indeed, and someone mentioned a report, and there has been different reports done in other countries, and it seems still inconclusive and up for debate. Would you have a fracking site in your area? Personally, I would be happy to have it, because some people say, oh, it's always those that are not going to have it in their area. But you disagree? You don't think?
Yeah, it's not for me, but I'm an NIMBY, so, I don't want anything coming to my local area. But there you go. Let us know what you think. GBViews at gbnews.uk. But now we're going to take a short break, and after that, the total number of migrants crossing the channel could reach 30,000 this year. Some of them being just children, of course. What is Liz Truss's plan to tackle this migration crisis? We know we also have a new Home Secretary, Suella Braverman. What's she going to do about it? We'll be discussing all of that after the break.
Good morning, it's 11:32. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Patients in England will be expected to get an appointment with their GP within 2 weeks, under plans to be unveiled by the new Health Secretary. Under the reforms, it's also thought Therese Coffey will pledge patients with urgent needs will be seen on the same day. It's part of a drive to improve access to doctors' appointments as she unveils her NHS plan for this winter and next. The Bank of England is expected to unveil the biggest hike in interest rates for over 3 decades. The Monetary Policy Committee is expected to increase rates by up to 0.75 percentage points. That means a potential interest rate of 2.5%, which would be the highest the UK's seen since the 2008 financial crisis. The government's lifted a ban on fracking in England in a bid to increase what it calls homegrown sources of energy. Unveiling the measures, Business Secretary Jacob Rees-Mogg said the government needed to pursue all avenues to provide energy security. But Labour said claims the measures will help reduce energy bills are nonsense. It's thought the plans could lead to over 100 new licences being issued across the country, despite concerns the practice could cause earthquakes. A 16-year-old boy has been arrested on suspicion of murder in connection with the death of a 15-year-old boy who was stabbed to death in Huddersfield yesterday. An investigation has been launched after the teenager died in hospital following an attack close to the entrance of North Huddersfield Trust School. The head teacher says they've lost a wonderful student from their school community. And a spectacular new image of Neptune has been released by NASA. The James Webb Space Telescope has captured the clearest view yet of the planet, seen for the first time in infrared light. It's the most comprehensive look at Neptune's rings in 3 decades. TV Online and DAB+ Radio, this is GB News. Here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound will buy $1.130 and €1.146. The price of gold currently stands at £1,475.63 per ounce.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
to each and every one of you
for helping our great nation
find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Across England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. On TV,
on radio and online.
We're proud to be
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
On the Mark Steyn Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flop at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Steyn Show.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
Good morning, it's 11:37 and this is To The Point with Mercy Moroki and Inaya Falarin Iman on GB News. We're live on your TV, online and radio.
Well, the annual number of migrants arriving across the Channel into Kent has reached 30,000 in terms of its milestone. Yesterday morning, migrants wearing winter coats, some carrying youngsters, boarded buses in the Kent town, having been picked up by RNLI boats.
Yes, well, it was also revealed by Downing Street that Prime Minister Liz Truss did not discuss migrant crossings across the Channel during her meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron on Tuesday. That's despite the growing crisis.
Well, joining us now in the studio is Alf Mehmet, Chairman of Migration Watch. Thank you for joining us on the programme. I mean, you've come on GB News several times to talk about the migration crisis, particularly in relation to the Channel. I mean, have you seen any desire or actual action from the government to really address this? Because it seems to only be spiralling out of control.
I think the desire's there, and I'm pretty sure that Priti Patel would have given anything to have solved the problem. Clearly, it ain't easy. I don't think that anything that's happened so far, Rwanda included, because we haven't actually got going with that yet, I don't think anything is going to dissuade either the traffickers or indeed from people from jumping into boats and coming over. So far, really, I don't think anything has happened that is likely to have an impact on the numbers coming across. And at the present rate, as we've been saying for some time, it's going to be around 55,000 by the end of the year. That's a huge number. It's a small town, for goodness sake. A couple of years ago, it was a fraction of that. So there's pressure on Suella Braverman, who I think actually is capable of getting a grip.
What do you think the difference is between her and Priti Patel, though? Because obviously you said that Priti Patel had that desire, she came out with all of these plans, but what do you think is the difference that would mean that Suella Braverman could actually achieve something in this?
Far be it for me to be critical of Priti Patel, who I like very much, and I think her heart was in the right place. To be fair to her, I don't think that she got the sort of support from the top, from the Prime Minister. Boris Johnson, always a liberal on immigration. If he could avoid dealing with it, then he would. The policies that have been introduced, I think if they actually get off the ground and start to be implemented, they could have an effect. I always said that Rwanda was never the solution. It was foolish to suggest that here we have this deal with Rwanda and it's the solution to all our problems. It isn't. It has to be part of a wider package, and the French, I'm afraid, also have to play their part. You mentioned, Mercy, that there was no discussion about the Channel when the Prime Minister and President Macron met yesterday. I think that was a missed opportunity and very disappointing, actually, because if they don't collectively show the will to deal with this problem, it's just going to get worse. It's in our interests and French interests to solve it. And I think that the French have got to think again about how they're going to help us do that.
I'm just going to throw some figures at you that quoted in the Telegraph yesterday. I want you to firstly confirm if they're true, because they're quite extraordinary, and then perhaps try to explain them. So it says that the total for September has gone past 5,300, which I find extraordinary, and Albanians now account for up to 60% of the crossings. Is that true?
Certainly that's what's happening at the moment, and the bulk of those who have been crossing over a period have been Albanians. That place where there's war, there's persecution, that's why they want to join the European Union, of course. I mean, it's
why is that?
ridiculous.
Why Albania?
Why Albania?
Yeah. Why are there so many? Why the proportion is so high?
It's exactly the same if you ask that question of the number of sub-Saharan Africans, for example, coming over, those coming from Libya across the Mediterranean. They're all fleeing poverty. This is economic migration. And I'm afraid that until we accept that it isn't asylum, this is not a matter of them fleeing persecution or whatever, in accordance with the 1951 Refugee Convention and the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights. That has nothing to do with it. And that's really what we've got to acknowledge now that these people are coming here for a better life.
But but what proportion, according to your figures, would you consider genuine asylum seekers then? I know it's hard to say, but I mean, are we talking a very small number or a considerable chunk?
Put it this way, when the original agreements were reached and treaties were put in place, it was people coming from places where, for their religious beliefs, for their political beliefs, they were being tortured, they were being persecuted in some way. Now, I would argue that the majority of those people who are coming over are maybe fleeing poverty and hardship, but they're not, in the strictest sense of the word, people who qualify for asylum in the way that it was originally intended. What proportion? I'm afraid you've really got to ask that of the Home Office. They know very often the benefit of the doubt is given. And I'm afraid that the sooner we start actually not giving the benefit of the doubt, the better.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, Chairman of Migration Watch. And, you know, one of the things, just very quickly before we move on, that really frustrates me is that there's nothing compassionate about a society that cannot control its own borders. Many of these people will go into criminal gangs, be victims of all sorts of absolutely horrendous things within society, and will not feel safe going to the police or health services because they'll be fearful of being deported. There's nothing compassionate about a society that cannot control its borders, and I think we need to shift the kind of moral high ground in the conversation.
Yes. Well, thank you for that view, Inaya, and thank you for all your views as well, and keep getting them in, gbviews@gbnews.uk. Well, we've been talking all morning, I'm sure you've noticed, about the government lifting the ban on fracking. Well, here to react to the news is Francis Egan, who's CEO of fracking firm Quadrilla. It's great to have you on this morning on such a huge day for fracking. I'm assuming you very much welcome the government lifting this moratorium.
Yes, I think it's a very sensible and a very timely decision given the energy crisis that the whole country and all of Europe is currently facing. And hopefully it will lead now to being able to resume operations and develop our shale gas resource for the benefit of the whole country.
What do you make of the some of the concerns that were raised both in Parliament, we were watching a minute ago, and in this general debate, that actually some of the safety concerns still haven't been entirely resolved, and people aren't 100% sure that when fracking is resumed, that they can be guaranteed that safety, especially when it comes to seismic events, especially when it comes to things like water and air pollution?
Well, I don't think people need to have any concern about their safety. There's been no incidents of anyone's safety being impacted. I think it's acknowledged that there have been a number of tremors, but in fact only two minor tremors in Lancashire. And what we've said to the government is you should apply the same rules to fracking as you do to mining, as you do to quarrying, as you do to geothermal, as you do to construction. We're not asking for any more or any less, but we had a completely different standard and were reported against that standard. So I don't think people need to have any concerns about their safety, but what they can be hopefully waking up to in a few years' time is a very significant community benefits from the hundreds of millions of pounds that could flow into local communities from a portion of the revenue from these sites.
Yeah, on that point, Francis, I mean, could you make the case for fracking for us? Because even though you say many of these things, a lot of people do have concerns, and for whatever reason, the case for fracking has not seemingly cut through strong enough with the public than other sources of energy, such as wind and solar and so on. So what do you think is the positive case that would really convince people that are on the fence?
Well, I have no objections to wind, solar or other forms of energy, but the fact of the matter is that we use large quantities of gas and we will continue to use them for decades to come. Every sensible analyst, including the Climate Change Committee, recognise that. And what has happened is we have effectively given up exploring and producing our own gas, particularly onshore in the UK. And what that has meant is we are reliant on ever more expensive and less secure gas imports, including, frankly, shale gas from the United States. Now, if instead we develop our own resources, not only do we not have to rely on others to give us our energy, but there are a huge amount of tax benefits for the exchequer, local community benefits, and the potential to lower energy prices. And it's as simple as that. You know, we should be developing our own energy. Absolutely every country wants to do that.
And just finally, Francis, I mean, how long, though, will we be able to get the gas and the energy from fracking? Because we've just had this ban removed, but some people are saying, well, actually, it may not really be of use to us for several years. So what is the quickest time for us to actually be able to benefit from this?
Well, I think the size of the resource is such that this is not a sticking plaster to solve today or tomorrow's energy bills. This is a solution to our energy needs for decades to come, and I think it needs to be viewed in that context, not as something that is going to be here today and gone tomorrow. And that's why it's so important that we get after it. You know, it is a 50 years worth of UK gas supply potentially lying underneath our feet. Why not develop that rather than pay Middle East countries, America, Russia, whoever it is, to give us our own energy?
Well, Francis, thank you so much for joining us to discuss this. We'd love to have you back on another time as this conversation develops. Of course, the lifting of the ban has just been officially announced. Thank you for joining us. Francis Egan, CEO of fracking firm Quadrilla.
No, it's a very interesting debate, and as we saw with the debate in Parliament, lots of MPs have very passionate views about this, and so I think it's still going to be a heated conversation. We'll be bringing you all of that as it unfolds.
Yes, indeed. Well, now to a completely different story, which I hadn't heard of, actually. Cannabis sweets are being packaged to look like bags of Haribos and Skittles and are now being sold over social media platforms like Instagram and TikTok.
Yes, well, police say that the fake brandings make them look more attractive to children, and at least 6 have been taken to hospital after eating cannabis sweets. One child was only 8 years old.
Yes, well, concerns remain that these drugs are being used to lure children into trafficking by using them to sell and deliver them to users.
Well, joining us now is Peter Reynolds, President of CLEAR, Cannabis Law Reform. Thank you for joining us on the programme. Could you just set out your position on the current legal and criminal framework for cannabis? Do you support decriminalisation? Do you think that we should be tougher with criminalisation or full legalisation, just to be clear?
Oh, no, I think what we should be going for, in fact, I think it's the only sensible solution is full legal regulation. So that means that you regulate the production and supply of cannabis to make it available to adults in a controlled manner. I mean, the story that you're talking about today is a direct result of our existing drugs policy, because there are no legitimate channels for people to access cannabis. What happens is that the business is taken up by criminal gangs, by organised crime, and of course they have no rules or regulations governing them.
Well,
so they will do this.
A lot of people would disagree with you there, because regardless of if we made it legal for adults, criminal gangs may still exploit the ability to be able to access children and to sell it to children, because even under a regulated system, we would not be allowing children to have it. So how would regulating the market have anything to do with this particular problem that's going on?
Well, yes, I mean, of course. I mean, you can never eliminate all access by children, just as you can't eliminate all access to tobacco and alcohol. But I mean, it's a well-established truth that it's easier nowadays for children to get hold of cannabis than it is for them to get hold of tobacco or alcohol, because we have age limits. It's not going to stop everything, and all you can do in any drugs policy is seek to minimise harm. You're never going to eliminate it completely. I mean, this idea of packaging cannabis products to look like sweets really comes from California, and it's not something that really we have a cultural parallel here. I mean, and as and when eventually the government wakes up to the tremendous harm that its current approach to drugs policy is causing and introduces a regulated system, then we can make decisions like this. We can say, no, we're not going to have packaging like that.
A counter argument would actually be that it's the normalisation of it that is effectively promoting it to young people. So regulating it, legalising it, and these policies that give us a softer approach is actually saying to a lot of young people that it's not that bad, and therefore makes it more attractive.
It's not a softer approach. I mean, the point is we have no control over it at all at the moment because the government has abandoned all control to criminals. I mean, there's a parallel with the immigration story you're running at the moment as well. You know, there's a tremendous demand from people who want to get into the UK. And because we don't offer them any legitimate channels to do so, the criminals exploit that. And the harder we try and stop that, the harder we clamp down on it, the higher the criminals are able to raise their prices for people to come in. And it's exactly the same thing with drugs.
Well, I mean, Peter Hitchens, for example, and many other people that are very passionate about this issue actually argue that it's been de facto decriminalised in this country anyway, that actually the police do not clamp down hard on the distribution of possession of cannabis.
True. I think that's true. And that is a terrible situation, but it's because the government fails to take control of it. Decriminalisation is a very dangerous halfway measure, because decriminalisation removes the penalties and yet leaves the market in the control of gangsters. You know, the fact is there's an enormous demand for cannabis in this country. 3 million adults consume it at least once a month. 5 million adults consume it at least once every 3 months. And 10 million adults consume it at least once a year.
That's not an argument for it to be regulated, but I take your point, Peter Reynolds.
It must be, because if there's that much demand for something, and you simply try and wipe it out. I mean, we don't live in a authoritarian regime where you can simply stop people doing what they want to do. It's an unrealistic attitude to take. And all we do by trying to stop it is cause more harm.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm sure we will revisit this subject because many people have very strong views on it. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with that subject this morning. Peter Reynolds, President of Clear Cannabis Law Reform. Thank you.
I enjoyed that. Thank you, Peter. Let's finish off the programme. We've got a couple of minutes with some of your views. Again, lots of them on fracking. William says the case against fracking does not stack up. It will not cost the government any money, unlike insulating homes. So fracking does not work. Why not let private investors waste their money to prove this?
Well, interesting point. Have the market do its job.
And that's the point the Business Secretary, Jacob Rees-Mogg, made. He said, Conservatives using the market, who'd have thought it? Okay. Well, that is it from us here at To The Point. But up next is GB News Day with Mark Longhurst and Gloria De Piero, so don't go away for that. But first is your weather.
Hello, I'm Aidan McGibbon from the Met Office. Rain in places, primarily central parts of the UK, so northern England, parts of Wales as well through the rest of the day. Drier to the south and to the north of that rain because it's all down to a cold front which is slicing the country in two. It brought rain to Scotland and Northern Ireland overnight. That wet weather still across southern Scotland, but it's now pushing into northern England, north and west Wales, and really, it's a slow-moving feature, and that rain will be heavy and steady at times, especially over the hills of North Wales and northwest England. Also fairly damp for parts of eastern Scotland until the end of the afternoon, but brighter skies to the far northwest for Northern Ireland, as well as for southern parts of England, and it's in the south where we'll see the highest temperatures, 21 or 22 Celsius, mid to high teens elsewhere. Now, through the evening, the area of cloud and rain sinks south. It turns more showery, so the rain will be on and off, but there'll still be some heavy bursts at times, reaching the southeast by dawn. Clearer skies for northern England, parts of Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland later on. 1 or 2 showers still in the far northwest. And a cooler night to come, where we've got those clearer skies, temperatures dipping into the mid-single figures. But a mild start to the day for the southeast, and that's where we keep the cloud and some showery rain, some heavy showers at times as well. Elsewhere, a brighter day to come with sunny spells, but further showers, I think, for Scotland, Northern Ireland, as well as parts of northern England. 18 to 19 Celsius in the north. I think still the potential for 20 Celsius in the far south, depending on how much brightness we see coming through. The rain will be heavy at times, though, and we'll continue to see that through Friday night for the far southeast. Clearer skies elsewhere and a cool start to the day on Saturday. Further showers in places on Saturday, but some sunshine in between.
It's a big week for the economy with likely interest rate rises and a raft of government announcements. On Friday, Newbie Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng unveils a mini budget that will be anything but mini as ministers move to help millions of cash-strapped households cope with spiralling utility bills. Join us on GB News from tomorrow morning and throughout the day for all the sharpest news, views and insights into what this vital budget statement means for you and your family on GB News, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
To each and every one of you.
for helping our great nation
Find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Across England, Scotland,
Wales and Northern Ireland.
On TV.
on radio and online.
We're proud to be
The People's Channel, Britain's
News channel.
On the Mark Steyn Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flop at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Steyn Show.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.